On today's Locked On Bucks, we continue our look at draft prospects. Today, focusing on the wing players. There's one name that I think most Bucks fans have fallen in love with and attached themselves to. We'll do a deep dive on him and take a look at some other intriguing names coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on YouTube as well, parts of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Camille, yesterday we went through the bigs, and it was really two names that we primarily focused on. Oso Ighodaro also mentioned, but really coming down to Kel'el Ware and Day'Ron Holmes. Boy, in the day that's passed, it seems like there's been more and more traction on Kel'el Ware to the Bucks, especially we don't want to drift too far away from draft prospects, but I believe it was Kevin O'Connor who had a little blurb earlier today on Thursday that the Bucks could explore moving Brook Lopez. And there are a couple of teams that have shown interest. As we mentioned, he's still productive, right? I think the big check against him is he's 36 years old, and there's one style of play that you can play with Brook Lopez on the floor, but he's still productive at that and scoring. So there is going to be some interest and some value with Brook Lopez. So I think with that and the fact that either way, as we mentioned yesterday, you want to start to look ahead a bit to life after Brook, you can see more traction for a big and especially Kel'el Ware. Today, we're going to take a look at some of the wing players that have been projected to go right around where the Bucks are drafting, and the Bucks have been linked to. Very similar story for me, at least, and curious to hear your thoughts as to yesterday's show and the deep dive on the bigs, and that it really kind of came back to two names for me of, okay, these are the two that make the most sense for me. So let's start with one of those names. And he is featured on the thumbnail for today's episode. He is the guy that I think most Bucks fans have kind of attached themselves to and fallen in love with, especially when you saw the offensive variants of the Bucks last year and saying, how do we get back to that mixture with some defense? This name would undoubtedly do that. And that is Ryan Dunn of Virginia. I've seen a few write-ups of arguably the best defender in this draft. I hate to speak in absolutes. I don't think it's arguable. I think when you look at the intangibles and everything he did at UVA, he is clearly the best defender that's in this draft. Defended 1 through 4 in college with a 6'7", 6'8" frame that he has. You would assume he's going to be able to do most of the same in the pros, probably needs to add a little bit of bulk. He was a very good offensive rebounder, has a wingspan above 7 feet. And there were a couple of things that stood out to me as we'll highlight the positives before we get into the other side of the coin. He had 25 steals and 27 blocks through his first 11 games last year.
Nuts.
No one had done that since Joel Embiid, Nerlens Noel, and Anthony Davis. All big men, and with the exception of Nerlens Noel, all very impactful big men at the NBA level. That's the type of thing that you saw defensively with Ryan Dunn throughout the course of especially last season as he stayed 2 years at Virginia. There were comps thrown around to DeAndre Hunter, who, of course, was also a Virginia product. I've seen Scotty Barnes comps thrown his way as well. That's all on the defensive side, because that brings us to the other piece of the coin, Camille, and it is just, I don't know where to begin with the offense. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't good. He was a 20% shooter on 3, 50% free throw shooter. The offensive intangibles are not there. As we've talked about many, many times, you can work with shooting coaches, you can work on those skill sets, and you do see him improve. I don't expect him to become a lethal shooter at the NBA level, but you could see improvement there. The thing that you really can't is you either have that athleticism and ability defensively or you don't, and he does. So that's the positive. I think it's a tougher pill to swallow when you see where the offense is at.
Yeah, that's the downside for him, right? Like, to your point, what makes Ryan Dunn so exciting as a prospect is that defensive potential. Like, he truly does have all defense potential. You mentioned some of his numbers in college. Something else that stood out to me was just that he had the 10th best block percentage in the NCAA last year. Like, this is a wing. He has the 10th best block percentage. He averaged like 8.5 stocks per 100 possessions. Like, this guy is a real defender. He can be a great help defender. He can go and get chase down blocks. He's excellent on the ball. He's good at the rim. Like, he's just a special defender. One other comp that I did hear for him was Matisse Thybulle. And it was like, and that's an accurate one because like the offense was a little bit slower behind that defense. Thybulle has been able to put together some semblance of a reliable 3-point shot, but Ryan Dunn at this point where he's coming into the league, he's not there yet. And we saw it took Thybulle a few years himself just to get to a respectable 3-point shooting level. Like, Dunn was a 20% 3-point shooter throughout his college career. He was a pretty good cutter. That's one way that he was able to get some of his buckets there. But you really want him for the defense. So a question that I have for Ryan Dunn, and he is somebody, just the prospect of him, who I was like, I like this player because I like defensive guys, but thinking about his fit on the Bucks, one argument that some people have had against drafting Ryan Dunn is like, hey, what about Andre Jackson Jr.? Don't the two of them have some type of positional overlap? And I thought about that, but when I was looking at the tape, what Ryan Dunn does defensively is just, it's different than what Andre brings to the table. It's different. And Andre also has a bit more playmaking chops within his repertoire. Like, they're not a one-to-one type of player, but defensively, what Dunn does is what is the most tantalizing. But I do have questions about what his fit might be on this Bucks team with, everybody talking about the lack of shooting and how you need shooting around Giannis, so on and so forth. And we've had conversations as well about, well, if you have the gravity of Giannis and Dame out there, they're going to try to cheat off of somebody. And Dunn would be that type of guy who they cheat off of. So how can you find ways to try to mask his offensive deficiencies while getting him playing time because of what he does on the defensive end? Is the real question for Dunn at this point.
The Andre Jackson Jr. piece, I mean, it's a good point. And I would say Andre Jackson Jr. is an energetic and good defender. Ryan Dunn is, I've seen him labeled as a chaos creator on defense. You mentioned the block rate. He averaged more than 2 blocks per game a season ago. And not only that, I mean, I didn't see a ton of Virginia, but when you get ready for this, you go back and you watch a lot of the highlights. And granted, we're seeing the best plays. But you got the sense of this was kind of the normal occurrence for him when you would see him on one half of the floor and still coming over to the other half of the floor to contest plays and shots and sticking with his man, being cognizant of somebody darting to the dunker spot and essentially defending 2 players on one possession with some of those high IQ plays and certainly athletic and defensive ability that he brings. So that to me is what makes him, I think, the most intriguing guy in this draft class. Because I think when it comes down to it, and I want to get to what you kind of hinted at just a minute ago there, but what it comes down to for me, what makes this very difficult, if Ryan Dunn is on the board when the Bucks draft, assuming they keep that 23rd pick, is for all of the flaws that we pointed out, and we may even be underselling it. It's not a pretty offensive game. You mentioned his cutting ability. He has a very awkward shooting motion. It's very slow. He comes across his body. We went through the numbers, not great in terms of percentages. But again, you feel like at the pro level with the staffs that you have, you can work with that and you can ideally improve. I think if he could get to where Matisse Thybulle is in 3-point shooting from the corner, absolutely fantastic, because he projects to be a much better defender than Matisse Thybulle does. So if you can get that, you'd be over the moon. But what I keep coming back to, what makes it challenging and not easy to discount and write that off, is I don't know that there's anyone in this draft that is going to do anything better than Ryan Dunn does defensively. Like, that skill set was elite in college. Not to say that it's going to become elite day one at the pro level, but we've seen the impact of guys like Herb Jones, DeAndre Hunter. Those comps were thrown out there. Obviously, DeAndre Hunter was much more polished offensively at that level than Ryan Dunn was, but we've seen struggles for DeAndre Hunter. The Scotty Barnes one, you didn't see a ton of, but you saw some of those comps, and there's some spot on comps between that. I still think Ryan Dunn is far more athletic than Scotty Barnes, but he's more of a hub and more of an offensive piece than Ryan Dunn is. But that last part is the challenge, because I've seen this rush to move to this quick assertion, and I hate to speak in absolutes, of, well, what the Celtics winning the championship taught us is you cannot have any one-way players. You got to have two-way guys across the board. You can't be weak in this position. The Celtics were the team that won that basically, if not none, had the fewest weaknesses and fewest spots for you to exploit. And look, that's all well and good. I just don't know that we're fully there. I don't know that we're ever going to be there, where it's always going to be, hey, all 30 teams, potentially 32 in a couple of years, are loaded with 10 guys that are two-way players. You're always going to have those outliers.
Yeah,
it's not realistic. Yeah, it's not realistic. But I think the challenge is you just can't have three of those guys on the floor at the same time. And that's going to be, it's probably the wrong way to frame it, because Giannis is a two-way player. But your point about the shooting would be the challenge with Ryan Dunn, because assuming Andre Jackson Jr. is still on the team, some of those lineups that we talked about, what if you move on from Brook Lopez and you don't have, if Giannis is your five, you don't have five out.
Right.
And that would be the challenge of, yes, you have Dame. Yes, you have Chris Middleton on the floor. You have Giannis's ability to really get in the paint and score around the rim. But if your other two guys on the floor in those moments are, let's say, Ryan Dunn and Andre Jackson Jr., that gives the defense a couple of areas to really say, look, if this guy gets up to 20 and knocks down open jumpers, we will live with it.
Exactly.
We're focusing our attention to these other two guys.
Yeah, and that's the way it goes. But one thing I'll say about Ryan Dunn that I do like about his game is that he seems to really understand where his strengths and weaknesses are. He's not somebody who is going out there being like, well, I'm going to put this mid-range, like I'm going to do a fadeaway. Like he's going to play within himself. And I think as he develops, that IQ comes in handy, because we mentioned his cutting prowess. He's very good at cutting. He's not a creator, like we mentioned, but he doesn't make many mistakes as well. He knows what he's good at. He's going to try to be at the rim as close as he can. He's going to try to cut. He's going to use the touch finishes. Like that's what he's looking to do. And having that internal awareness of where your strengths and weaknesses lies, I think tends to be part of the problem for some younger guys, where they want to do it all. And, they have dreams of grandeur of like, I know I can make this shot, but it's like, it's not the best shot for you. But to your point about just the respect that he'll get from shooting the three, he's going to have to earn that. Like teams are going to leave him, to your point. And in college, when teams left him, he missed a lot of wide open looks, and he hasn't showed much touch either from the free throw line. So that's something where he is going to have to improve. I mean, last year coming out of the draft, talking about Andre Jackson Jr., we mentioned like he can do just about everything but shoot. And we were a bit surprised about how well he shot the ball during his rookie year. Again, he didn't get much respect for it. So a lot of the looks were open, but he didn't have any hesitation knocking them down. And he was able to do that. So I do think Andre Jackson Jr.'s internal improvement is also going to be big for the Bucks, because if you can limit that, let's say that they do draft Ryan Dunn and they keep Andre Jackson Jr. as well. If Andre turns himself into a respectable shooter, if he's on that path already, that gives some better spacing on the floor if you were to roll out Dunn with him and a Giannis, but still, that still shrinks the floor a lot. So I'm really, really, really interested in Ryan Dunn's defensive potential, and the fact that it's almost, I've seen some people say generational defensive talent. And when you have something like that, and if it's on the board, I think like you got to find a way just to make it fit or make it work at that point.
Yeah, it just seems like I think there's a good chance he's not going to be there at 23, that he seems like one of those guys that's starting to really climb draft boards. And Sam Vecini had this to say about him: one of the best defensive players I have ever evaluated.
Yeah.
He is a genuine all defense candidate long term if his offense becomes sufficient to stay on the court. Along with Houston's Jamal Shed, a name we're not going to get to in the guards comps that we get into in tomorrow's show, but he's intriguing as a guy that likely is going to go either undrafted or you could get in the second round. But Dunn was one of the two most disruptive defenders in the country, along with Shed. Averaged more than a steal and more than 2 blocks per game, all while playing for a slow-paced Virginia team. He covers an exceptional amount of ground defensively. He's a monster help side defender, and on top of that, incredibly switchable. Offense is the big question. He did not play confidently on that end by the end of the season and seemed to want to get rid of the ball quickly. He also struggled to shoot, as we documented, 23% on his threes while attempting less than 1 per game. However, he performed well in workouts with multiple teams and might go even higher than projected. So it does seem like, as we said, that one skill set, the defense, it is so lethal and elite that it's going to be hard to overlook for a lot of teams, especially as we see the league moving more and more to athleticism. And you need guys that can defend multiple positions. That's what Ryan Dunn is, in theory, going to bring to wherever he ends up. The offense is just the big question mark. So another one of those guys that is incredibly intriguing. We pointed out the one flaw, but obviously there is a major, major strength there for Ryan Dunn. The next guy that we are going to profile here after the break, another very interesting name to me, in that when we talk about a Bucks team looking to get younger and find guys that could potentially contribute this year, I think this next name certainly fits that bill. So we'll get into that coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Game Time is the place to get all of your tickets for the summer. If you love going to MLB games this summer, use Game Time to find the best ticketing experience that is out there and check off all of those major league ballparks from your bucket list. It is that easy through the Game Time app. They have last minute deals where you can save up to 60% off when you buy last minute for baseball games, any sport, concerts, comedy, theater, you name it. There's flash deals where you save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game, all in pricing. So in other words, you can see exactly what it is you are going to be paying with no sticker shock once you get to that checkout screen. And most importantly, as we mentioned, if you're maybe checking some things off your bucket list, traveling around to all the MLB stadiums that are out there, you can use the Game Time app to see views from your seat, a panoramic view from where you would be sitting. You can see that in the app before you buy those tickets. And most importantly, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. If you find a lower price, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use that code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN all day and have to constantly turn down the volume because of all the shouting, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. It brings us to the next name on our list here, Camille, and that is Tristan da Silva, who, when we talk about guys that, again, you want to level set your expectations for the 23rd overall pick, but when we talk about guys that could step in and contribute, I think Tristan da Silva is one of the guys that has the best chance of doing that, at least for the area, roughly where the Bucks are going to be picking outside of the lottery. He is certainly a high floor, maybe a lower ceiling type of player. The two comps I've seen the most thrown out for da Silva are Kyle Kuzma, which would be the ultimate pie in the sky wish. If you could get a Kyle Kuzma here at 23rd and continue to develop him, great. The other one, which really stood out to me, and it's not so much everything that he does per se, but it's just what we said, stepping in immediately, being a contributor, and at least feeling like, from day one, you have a rotational piece here. Jaime Jaquez Jr. of the Miami Heat, in that he is a winner and somebody that can step in and contribute immediately. We saw him play both on and off the ball at Colorado. He was a spot-up shooter. He was very good at attacking mismatches and closeouts, and really the projections for him, which again would play in very well for the Bucks, are this guy is an ideal third, maybe fourth option offensively, which is where he would be best case scenario from day one with the Bucks. But he has been tabbed as a high IQ player who's okay defensively. That's where the limitations really stand out with his strength and length especially. But he has a very high motor, and he may end up being an oversized guard because of some of those frame issues. But shooting is that lethal skill, a 40% shooter on three on about 5 attempts per game last season, 60% true shooting. That ranked in the 94th percentile and 82nd percentile in catch and shoot. He is 23 years old. So that's the other piece of it when we talk about being a guy that could step in and contribute immediately, and you feel like maybe a high floor, lower ceiling guy because of the age. There's a lot of thought of, hey, he may be what he is. But if this is who you get at 23, and he's a guy that could be 6th, 7th man, something like that for years to come, you will take that.
High floor, lower ceiling. I think it's the best way to describe da Silva. Like, he's a player who could fit on multiple rosters because of the fact that he does a little bit of everything well. Doesn't do anything necessarily like elite where you're like, oh my gosh, this is his best trait. But his best trait is the fact that he can do a little bit of everything pretty well. For some, the age might work against him. But in this perspective for it, like, I think it works in his favor as somebody for the Bucks to target, because he comes off as somebody who's just more ready to play immediately. And that's always been one of the challenges when you have contending teams. That's why there are a lot of teams in the lottery, a lot of contenders that would be interested in having da Silva, because he is somebody who projects to be able to come in and contribute immediately. He doesn't necessarily have the development plans that you need. Of course, there's always room to get better. But coming out of college, he seems like somebody who's ready to go. He can create a little bit for himself, not necessarily the greatest at that, but he can move the ball. He can space the floor. You mentioned the fact that he shot over 40% from three in his last year. He was about a 39% three-point shooter throughout his entire college career. So it's been consistent. Like, there are some guys who you see they had a great year shooting a three coming off of a year where it's like, that's like a 15% difference. Like, what's real with this one? But with da Silva, that seems real. It's not exciting necessarily. It's just very like run of the mill. Like, I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do my job. And the fact that he is able to come in ideally and contribute is what makes him appealing, although he doesn't have elite traits in other areas. But another comp that I did see for him that kind of was like, oh, okay, was Kyle Anderson, just kind of like a bigger wing who can just do a little bit of everything. Never necessarily a star, but he can be a star at his role, which for a Bucks roster with Dame, with Giannis, with Chris, we hear it all the time. Be a star in your role, and he projects as somebody who can do that. Plus, he's 6'8". He's a bigger body as well, and he's a competitive defender. Like, I wouldn't say he's great at it, but he does put effort in on that side of the ball. He has a little bit of quickness where he can kind of switch screens a bit, and he's a smart player defensively as well, which is good because he's not super athletic. So he has to kind of use that mentality, that IQ that he has. But he's also somebody who, if the Bucks were to pick him, I don't think it would excite many people, but it would be one of those picks where it's like, but this could be something that works out where he can get into the rotation pretty quickly and play 10, 15 minutes where you're like, I feel good about this.
Understatement of the century, but a little more quickness than Kyle Anderson
Yeah,
that he
yeah,
has.
no,
But the rest of the offensive comps, I could see it. You know, we talked yesterday about guys being hubs. Certainly, what Kyle Anderson is, and it's not just shooting for Da Silva. I think that's what intrigues you the most. We mentioned defensively. Obviously, he is not Ryan Dunn. He's not in the neighborhood of Ryan Dunn. He's not even the same state as Ryan Dunn, right? But I've seen varying suggestions on he's fine in switching. But it's the full offensive package that he brings. And again, a guy that not developmental, and maybe there's not much more growth than what you see now at the collegiate level, but you get the sense what we saw at Colorado these last 2 years, that's enough to be the eighth guy on a team. It's seventh guy maybe come in. And I think we kind of overlook it at times, partially because Bucks fans hate the team. I get it, but I think we can understate Sam Hauser's defensive ability. He holds up well. It's the same thing that we say about AJ Green, but look at what Sam Hauser, the role that he filled with the Boston Celtics. That's if you could get that here with the 23rd pick from a guy like Tristan da Silva, you would absolutely love that. And I think a couple of things to go along with that. Again, the age, the big piece. Why you feel like it may be close to a finished product right now, but Sam Vecini saying it's been kind of mixed on him, but scouts really started to come around towards the end of last season at Colorado, the way he finished that year and his play in the NCAA tournament. Over those last 14 games, including the tournament, he shot 51% from the floor and 43% on his threes, made about 40% of his threes over the last 2 seasons at Colorado, moves well without the ball, can also handle the ball himself, and makes very good passing decisions. He processes the game quickly and plays at a high speed, even if he doesn't have great athletic tools. Not an elite defender, but he's smart, adequate against other forwards, and sharp off the ball. That he ticks a lot of boxes that make him profile well as a solid rotational player in today's NBA. And again, it's not so much the gameplay, the style of play, but the Sam Hauser piece, I think that to me is one of those comps in terms of what could you expect in stepping in right now and the type of role that he would take on. I think it profiles a little better than what Sam Hauser gave the Celtics last year. Part of that was who the Celtics had in front of Sam Hauser. But that type of guy, again, when we talk about just needing depth and guys that can do things, when you go back to, obviously injury is a big part of it, but the playoff run where you were just starved to find somebody that could handle the ball. I'm not saying you want Tristan da Silva to be your point guard, but that's a guy that could handle bringing the ball up in spots and attack some of that pressure that he sees and just play make, right? It's basically Giannis, Dame, and Chris Middleton as your guys that you feel like, okay, they can do something with the ball. So adding more pieces like that is important. And this may be one spot where you could do that.
I mean, you mentioned how everybody kind of looking at the Boston Celtics and saying like we need to do this, but another aspect of what the Celtics did was that they had a lot of guys on the court at one time who can dribble, who can pass, and who can shoot. So it's like if you can just make the right decision and you can move the ball around and try to get the best shot possible, you're in a good position. And that's something that Da Silva could fall into because he's a good shooter, he's a good passer, and he's a smart player as well. He's somebody who, as we mentioned, he's been mocked to the Bucks quite a few times. And at this point of the recording, I don't believe he's gotten a green room invitation yet. So that's something to keep my eye on, because after we recorded the Biggs episode, I was like, not both Ware and Holmes getting green room invitations, where I was like, not sure if they'll be there at 23, but I'm not sure the likelihood of Da Silva falling to the Bucks at 23. Like, it's possible for sure, because again, this is the kind of draft where not a lot of consensus. It's kind of dependent on how teams view the players, but although he doesn't have a high potential, I think the high potential theoretically from him comes from the fact, like we mentioned, that he can do everything well. He's a solid pickup. He would be a solid pickup, I think, for the Milwaukee Bucks, but I'll be keeping an eye on seeing if he gets that green room invitation over the next couple of days as well, which could indicate where he might be going in this draft and seeing if he might be available for the Bucks still.
And that's what makes this draft interesting is
Yeah.
there's no Wemby in it. There may be no Giannis in it, any real superstars, but some of these names, Tristan da Silva and some others that we went over, they're high floor guys. Or, just talking about Ryan Dunn, a guy that has one very elite skill set, that I think this draft class can get unfairly criticized because it lacks the superstar appeal. But I think there's going to be a handful of very good role players that come out of this draft and stick around in the league for years to come, potentially. And you go back to the 2000 draft that got knocked for the longest time of, man, this draft was terrible. And again, it didn't have any superstars. Michael Redd might have been the best player in that draft. But when you look at those names that came out of it, Kenyon Martin, Michael Redd, Mike Miller, Jamal Crawford, Hedo Turkoglu, Desmond Mason, those are all very good starters or rotational players that you found for years to come, long careers that all of those players had. Even Speedy Claxton was a very good backup point guard. So I think that's what we're looking at here. And again, I think that's also the spot the Bucks kind of need, right? You got Giannis, you got Chris Middleton, you got Damian Lillard, at least for the next couple of years. That's what you have. So you'd love to add some more of those types of pieces around them and guys that you feel comfortable stepping in and being those pieces, especially knowing as of this moment, all you've got to use in the offseason are veterans minimum. So it's going to be tougher and tougher to fill out the rest of that group. There's one more name we want to take an extended look at for the wing players here. We'll touch on that name coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, time to talk to you now about Prize Picks. It is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It's the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. It's easy, so easy that all you have to do is pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and have a chance to win up to 100 times your cash. You could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. Make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stats, and you're locked in. Prize Picks has promotions as well for you to dig through. We've got you covered every single week, from lowering players' stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chance of getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you post a losing lineup on Fridays. And Prize Picks even has the perfect time to try something new. With basketball now over, you can try esports this month, because every Wednesday and Saturday in June, if your lineup doesn't win, you get your entry fee back. Choose from Counter-Strike 2, Call of Duty, League of Legends, and more. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That code again, LOCKEDONNBA, when you download the Prize Picks app. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, it brings us to our final name for the Wings, Camille, and let's also remind everyone we did the Bigs yesterday. If you missed that episode, you can go back and check that one out. It was primarily focusing on Kelly Ware and Day'Ron Holmes. We're tackling the Wings here, just about through it. And tomorrow's show, we are going to do a deeper dive on the guards. Spoiler alert of sorts. Not quite as fun to pour through those guards. But let's wrap up the look at the Wings here with the other name that stood out to me. And I suppose, you and I, as we were getting ready for the show, discussed a handful of names here. I'll just mention some others that came up on our list. Harrison Ingram, Trenton Flowers, we talked about briefly about a week ago when we had talked about the Bucks working him out. Bobby Klintman, we mentioned yesterday on the show as well. He was somebody projected around the Bucks in a couple of mock drafts. Jalen Tyson out of Cal, and I believe Terrence Shannon, I don't know if I mentioned that name, out of Illinois. But that brings us to the final one that we're going to highlight here, and that is Kesan George out of Miami. So there's a question out there of, hey, what are the international prospects that intrigue you? Technically, that's what you get here, as he did play for Miami last season, but played in the second level, one level below where Victor Wembanyama did. in France, but he is a guy that I think once you get to him, the difference between he and Ryan Dunn, or he and Tristan da Silva, as we just went through, is it becomes more of this a long-term project where you would associate with drafting in the 20s or outside of the lottery of, yeah, you see some things here, but you also see some things that are tough to overlook. Late bloomer, that's been what everybody's been using to really gas him up and sell him. Shot over 40% on threes last year, and basically all or a majority of his field goal attempts were threes. Took 190 shots at the U, 130 of them were threes. He's a very streaky scorer, and by way of that, shooter. But I think the knocks, not a great ball handler. And I know he had 6'7", 6'8" size. He was a guard for Miami, and that's probably what he projects to be at the pro level because of some of those frame issues, but not a great ball handler, not really somebody that has court vision. Defense isn't really there. I've seen a few of the write-ups saying he falls asleep defensively. He's not very engaged. And I mentioned he played at that second level in France, really struggled to make any kind of impact, albeit 1 year, but struggled to make an impact on that team. He is widely viewed as somebody that is a long-term project. Yeah. He is not going to step in and help you from day one. And take this as what you will. The only real comp I have seen attached to him, and I forget who had this in their write-up, but the name they threw out, more athletic, but less skilled and not quite as defensive as Joe Ingles in his prime.
That's the one I saw too. Yeah, that's the comp I saw too. I said, interesting. But of the three guys that we have talked about so far, he is the most raw prospect. He is somebody who I don't foresee coming in, especially on a championship contending team, like getting some real burn. He is going to need some development. And that's part of the allure of George, is that you can see the flashes of what he might be able to do. So it's about if you have the patience to try to develop that for him as well, because to your point about him being a 3-point shooter, like that is what he did. That's what he was great at. That's his best skill set. He was a 95th percentile catch and shooter guy in college. And this is a one and done type of year for him, which also surprised some people of being like, oh, like this is going to be it. I thought you might come back for another year, but to your point about he has a natural guard skill set in that tall, thin frame, and the lean frame is part of the problem for him at the moment. Does not necessarily have an NBA ready body at the moment. A lot of guys come out of college who don't, but he's somebody who is going to have to bulk up and get stronger, especially if he wants to try to get to what people project for his defensive potential to be. Because some people look at him and say, like, although right now you don't see him as like an elite defender, he puts in the effort. You see he has the length. Like he could become somebody who's a versatile defender, not necessarily elite, but somebody who you can throw out there in some switches. But again, he has to get stronger and he has to develop just some more technique when it comes to how he plays defense. But the draw for him is really the 3-point shooting. Like the catch and shoot, as I mentioned, he shot 36% from pull-up threes. He's kind of creative when it comes to playmaking. Like he does see guys in the corner. If he gets more attention, he will make that decision to dump it off as well. So he's somebody with potential for sure. The projection, like draft range for him, is a little all over the place. Like he could be on the board in the second round at that point, which second round shot, you're like, this is interesting right here. I'm not as sure about him at 23. If the Bucks went that route, but a second rounder for me is more in line with where I see George.
Yeah, and I guess we'll share what Sam Vecini had to say about him as well. I'm not this high on George. He was invited to the NBA draft green room. He's seen as a potential option to be selected in the top 20, with even a couple of lottery teams doing due diligence to learn more about him. He is a big wing who can shoot, dribble for his size, and pass. However, he's not particularly explosive athletically. Never been productive at any stage of his journey to this point. Scored less than 3 points per game in the French second division last season and averaged fewer than double figures for Miami, a team that was one of the worst high major teams in the country by the end of the season. Still, he's a late bloomer who grew up to his current 6'7" frame over the last 18 months. he is seen as an upside swing who could be worthwhile for teams who like wings with size and shooting ability. In the Ringers mock draft by Kevin O'Connor, and this was a couple days ago that I last saw it updated. He has George going 26 to the Wizards. Also has Ryan Dunn going 25, slipping past the Bucks and going to the Knicks. Kevin O'Connor has Ryan Dunn going 25, and so does Sam Vecini of The Athletic, who we've been reading his write-ups here, has Ryan Dunn going 25 as well to the New York Knicks. Could you imagine Tibbs getting Ryan Dunn as that piece to add to his defense? But that's the thing about these wing players. Vecini, by the way, has George going 20 to the Cavaliers. Is all these names that we've mentioned, there's a lot of fluctuation in that same Ringer mock draft. Tristan da Silva, 17 to the Lakers. And in Kevin O'Connor's, I think he has him a little higher. He has him 16 to the 76ers. So we're seeing a lot of that variance of all of these names, even dating back to yesterday, looking at the bigs. They're guys that we're seeing going really anywhere from 15 to 25.
Yeah. And that's the thing with it. Like, there's some other guys too who I'm interested in. Like, I wonder how this is going to fall out for them in the draft. And that's what makes this draft in particular really exciting, because generally you have some type of semblance of agreement of like, okay, these guys are going to go in this range, but this is a type of draft where I think it's going to be a lot of surprises here, where you're like, oh, on my board, I had him at 32, but he went, right after the lottery ended. So I think it's going to be a lot of that in this particular draft, and a lot of guys, especially on the wing. You mentioned some other names when we started this particular segment, but Terrence Shannon is someone else who I'm really interested in. We know he has the legal things going on. He was just found not guilty, I believe, last week from his case, but just type of player he is. Like, again, not necessarily a bona fide 3-point shooter, but he's great in transition. He just has a lot of tools where you could see, like, if he can develop, this could be something special. But it's a lot of wing options in this draft. We know it's not the most top-heavy draft, but from what I have read and understand about this particular draft is that there should be some quality role guys in this draft, for some guys who might not be stars, but can be a star in their role. So the hope is that the Bucks can actually, if they keep the pick, land on one.
Yeah, Jalen Tyson, we mentioned as well, a little bit older, which, again, when you're a team, he's not quite as old as what we mentioned with the Silva. He's 21 years old. But when we mention teams like the Bucks, where you're trying to thread the needle as best you can, you tend to look at older prospects, not necessarily old prospects. Baylor Shireman out of Creighton, another one. He is older, 23 years old as well, a very good shooter. But there are, to your point, a lot of wings and bigger wings available in this draft that it seems like we're going to see most of them stick around as rotational pieces. Cam Christie, another one. I suppose it depends on where you classify him. If he's a wing, if he's a guard, he obviously has the bloodline and the lineage of both his brother and his father as well, being NBA guys. So he's another intriguing name. And that's really what it boils down to with this draft is, as we just mentioned, may not be any superstars in this. Again, who knows? Still too early to project that. But it does seem like there's rotational depth, quite a bit of it in this draft, more than I remember seeing in previous drafts, where there's a lot more. These are top loaded, big time prospects, and then a lot of long-term projects, boom or bust, that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing some of the comments. Some people are excited that Terrence Shannon's draft stock dropped, where it's like he has that top 10 potential. But with everything that was going on, his potential, not potential, but his stock has fallen somewhat. So I'm looking forward to the draft. I've never been somebody who was like a big draft person. But normally as the draft gets closer and closer, I get more and more excited. And this is one where, as we mentioned, where I think you can find some really good role players. And it's actually, I won't say necessarily beneficial that the Bucks are picking where they're picking, but this is the one draft where it's like at the top, we're not as sure about, but when you get past the lottery, you start getting to them 20s, you can find some quality players there. So that's the hope for the Bucks at the very least, if they keep this pick, which again is another conversation that we've been having of, do the Bucks really bring in 2 rookies into the season next year, or do they look to try to use one of these picks to trade and get some more established help immediately? So we'll have to keep an eye on the trades as well going forward.
2 rookies in addition to all the young players that we've already spent some time talking about. That is going to be the interesting part here, or one of the interesting parts, that and potentially what else they do in terms of moves leading up to the draft and shortly thereafter. A reminder again, we are going to be doing a live show during the first round of the draft in 6 days. We will promote when we figure out what's the time that makes the most sense to do it. We're thinking some point in the middle of the draft, so we can start to react to any moves that have been made, surprising selections, and still be doing it while we get to the Bucks pick. So you have that to look forward to next Wednesday. We are also going to be setting up an interview, or not setting up, we've set it up. We are going to be doing an interview with Van from Brew Hoop to dig into some of the things that he had mentioned earlier in the offseason about the Bucks cap situation and any potential moves. We just mentioned some of those rumblings of could they look to move Brook Lopez. Van beat Frank to it, even with the write-up on the second apron and the Bucks position there, how to avoid it. So we're going to catch up with him early next week to really get you set for the offseason, as we will be a couple of days away from the NBA draft. And on tomorrow's show, we're going to take a look at the guards that figure to be available when the Bucks are selecting here, primarily 23, as we didn't really focus on any of the second round picks, but we'll take a look at the guards on tomorrow's show. We also mentioned yesterday, Camille, we were toying with doing a bonus show every single week that focuses on the sweet science. I did not see a lot of negative feedback on that, so I think it is something we're going to go forward with. Again, it's not going to take away from Bucks content. It's just going to be a bonus show that's out there every week. So leave your comments about that and reach out to Camille and I on social media. We will be back tomorrow with a look at the guards. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.